Ashwin.
Hi,
How are you?
I'm good. Thanks for having me. Glad to be here.
Well, very nice. We've been living in very interesting times, quite unprecedented things happening all around.
That's right.
Uh, so, so, what's your take on the plight of urban poor in Delhi and elsewhere in India?
Well, I can definitely speak uh, to the conditions of the urban poor in Delhi. My research focuses on the homeless in particular. Um, right now, what we're seeing is since the lockdown started, an acute situation of hunger uh, amongst the homeless and daily wage migrants in the city. Uh, a lot of this is due to the pace at which the lockdown was announced and the lack of protections, particularly aimed at the major vulnerability that homeless and daily wage migrants face, which is their work situations. So when the lockdown occurred, mass unemployment was the first outcome, which led to a cascading situation of needing, of course, to secure basic needs in a haphazard fashion, food, and of course, shelter. So when the lockdown was announced at the end of March, what happened was that a few days preceding that, the Delhi Urban Shelter Improvement Board had notified shelters as sites for food delivery. Now, Delhi has about 200 shelters. It ranges between 190 to 230, 235, because there are temporary arrangements in the winters and sometimes during situations like this, a crisis event. So there were about 230 shelters when this happened, notified as places for food delivery. But what happened during that time was that these sites became magnets, not only for those who were chronically homeless or who were on the streets and who were in shelters before the lockdown occurred, but became sites, of course, for many of those people who became at least temporarily homeless because they had lost jobs and because they had lost also their places where they lived temporarily in the city, which sometimes are work sites.
Right. Well, I've got a few very interesting questions to ask you in terms of how did we let the situation blow out to be as big as it actually did blow out to?
Well, I think there's a tension between the inevitability of a crisis, or not the crisis, but the inevitability of uh, a scale of vulnerability that you're seeing right now in a situation like this. Uh, there were going to have to be stringent measures that the government was going to have to enact, and yes, rather quickly, of course. Um, but at the same time, the institutions that were in place, it's fair to say, were not uh, perhaps appropriately identified by stakeholders in the government, um, and in civil society, in terms of knowing exactly how to coordinate services at those sites. And this has led to a lot of confusion. The shelters are sites that are notified by the government as government spaces, which are supposed to provide, um, of course, shelter, but of course, connections to health services, and for particularly vulnerable populations like women and children, food services, Anganwadi services as well. Um, but they do actually run at the behest of several NGOs. So the system already had a vulnerability, which is that the a public policy such as shelters for a vulnerable population was by and large in the hands of civil society and NGOs. And at a time of crisis, what happens is that those organizations are not equipped, they don't have the capacity to absorb the shock that we've seen. And this problem is continuing right now.
And that's correct. So I just want to bring in another issue as to what I see as probably the roots of this particular problem blowing out as big as it actually did. And this, in some estimations, lie with the migrants issue being a concurrent subject in the constitution. It doesn't rest with the central government, nor rest with the state governments. So
Yeah.
you have this a particular context where anybody could shift the blame to anybody else, and there's also a possibility of nobody doing anything but everybody talking about it in a compassionate way. How far do you think this particular problem of the migrants issue being both the central subject as well as, I mean, it's neither being the central subject nor being the state subject, being in the concurrent list, prompted this crisis to evolve the way it did?
Yeah, no, that's a very important question. The Indo Global Social Service Society, I believe that's the acronym for it. I mean, it's IGSSS, has actually done a very good report engaging with this question. Essentially, what they've done, and this was about a few weeks ago, but what they've done is try to track the government orders, on the response to aggregately migrants, as we know them, uh, as one demographic, but done so in a way that they disaggregate who are the migrants, or who are the informal sector workers. And what they've shown is across different sectors there have been different responses, right? So, uh, construction workers, domestic workers, um, uh, street vendors, homeless people. What you see across the board is that there have been very limited, across all states, I should say, across all states, limited uh, provisions to protect against the most severe vulnerability across all of these groups, which is the shock of unemployment at the time of the crisis. There have been shades of you know provisions for food. In Delhi, you can say that the public policy for food distribution, at least in terms of activating the system for migrants, for homeless people, has been um, widely acknowledged, and the government is trying to connect those people to those systems. Um, but I think that the reason that you see across the board, across various types of migrants, meaning various migrants who fall into various different employment categories, why perhaps, I don't want to say definitively why, but plausibly, why there is such a lag in terms of states being able to respond uh, to those groups is because there's very little understanding about the heterogeneity of uh, of who the migrant is, of who informal sector workers are, and where they belong. What we're seeing, of course, is that uh, many of the migrants, and there are different corridors, right? So one major corridor we're seeing is that the UP Bihar. Uh, there's a UP Bihar corridor where there's a large contingent of people on the move who are originally from UP and Bihar, and have come to uh, Delhi, Punjab, for various types of employment needs. Um, so it's when we talk about state responses, we also must talk about coordinated state responses, and we also must then identify the corridors and uh, the corridors, the types of employment that are coming through that corridor, and the type of movement that large groups of people undergo from point A to point B, and maybe to point C and point D. And so I think part of the confusion is a lack of understanding of the heterogeneity of the migrant, and B, the points of movement. Where exactly are they coming from? Where are they exactly going to? We know a little bit more about where they're coming from because of the way data is
Right.
collected about identifying by birth or place of birth. But we know less about the movement, the reasons for the movement, and the structural kind of pitfalls in local economies, in local rural economies, and how those economies, or how the people that are not or falling through cracks of those economies, are then naturally plugged in through distress to other urban economies. And this is something that the COVID crisis is really showing us that we absolutely have to focus on. We absolutely have to understand those patterns of movement, the types of employment, and particularly types of employment that are heavily reliant on intermediaries. What we're seeing in the cities is that, or I should say, Delhi. Let me just be, let me just stick to what I you know or what I'm studying, which is that you see that unemployment is caused essentially because the intermediary uh, can no longer uh, take care of the group of workers that he has been assigned to. But what we know less about is the cohering needs that intermediary is also taking care of. The housing. When I say taken care of, I don't mean that's not necessarily a positive connotation. I'm just saying it's a relationship that these
Yeah.
workers have to their employment. So it's food, it's employment, and it's residence, right? And so what we're seeing is that that link in the chain, because that link in the chain is not identified, is not part of the quote unquote formal economy, because of course 90% of the economy is informal. We are therefore not being able to uh, forecast what happens during such a crisis as this. And we need to start looking at the parts of the economy and the parts of the cities that are in the dark, so to speak, where the processes are happening. Processes happen outside of the purview of law and legal recognition.
Right. So, Ashwin, you make some very important points there, like the coordinated efforts by state and the central government, and that kind of puts us back into the entire migrant crisis being a concurrent subject, neither a state subject nor a central subject. But then, more important than that, the other point that you made was on the migrant movement. Like the lack of data. But what has been baffling all of us generally is that we have so much of data on migrants by NSSO, by Ministry of Program Implementation and Statistics, by APAER, and we have bureaucrats both at the central government as well as the state government dealing with this data day in and day out,
Very
and
true.
making policies for the migrants day in and day out, and then that monumental ignorance of locking down, and then not being able to do this in a coordinated way, pretty much as you said, and also looking at this whole situation as something that could emerge, that very well was so palpable for everybody to know that this could simply blow out as a huge humanitarian crisis, which it actually did emerge as that. Yeah.
Right.
So how do we put these things together as an we've been having data not just about Delhi, but about, as you rightly said, UP, Bihar, and to which parts of the country does the UP, Bihar laborers act as those foundational laborers, the people working in the foundational sectors, the
Well,
informal economy.
I think
Yeah.
that's the operative word. I mean, foundational. I think that's the operative word. I think there has to be a normative shift in our
Hmm.
thinking. Uh,
Hmm.
of course, amongst the policymakers, but yes, also societally about what we view and understand as essential, um, essential workers. And I shouldn't just say that there are essential workers and non-essential workers. That's not what I mean. I mean that there is an overwhelming majority of laborers and people who work in our cities who are not afforded uh, basic labor protections. This is at once a normative problem where we accept that there are types of work uh, or that there are types of labor that should go into the production of the uh, mega city or the production of the development of a city without any kind of reciprocity, because we see it in our cities. We see the construction
Yep.
workers, we see how they live. We by and large know that um, they are availing these jobs at sites which also lack protection, labor chalks, um, places where it's not a formal system, even though there are 6 crore construction workers and about half of them are registered, right? So the, that's a huge number that are just completely in the dark, right? So having the data on hand, absolutely correct, and especially that the January 2017, I believe, when the report on migration was submitted to the government and acknowledged, of course, by people in the government that yes, there was data on hand, but unfortunately, maybe it does take a crisis of certain kind of magnitude to acknowledge that uh, the kinds of uh, jobs that many people, if not most, of the people in the country do should be afforded the same kind of labor protections that the 8 to 10% in the formal economy uh, have. And I think that this is something that is going to take a long time to move on. Uh, but with a crisis of this magnitude, when we're seeing, um, of course, these in the new, the media reports of the people saying, I may die of hunger before I get COVID or something like that. It's not a cliche. It's actually reality. And so I think we're looking at a catalyst in where India is, and having to acknowledge the inequities of labor and labor regimes that are perpetuated by lack of reciprocity and uh, rights. And alongside the data that we have, we need therefore a shift in our thinking about the provision of labor protections.
Yeah, yeah, right there. So, I mean, building this conversation onto those solutions that we're thinking,
Mhm.
uh, I have two questions. Let me put them out that way. The very first one is it's not just the labor issue. It's not just the migrant issue. It's a lot of other areas, including education, which falls in the concurrent list of our constitution. So that's probably a perfect recipe for disaster, and that's what the COVID-19 migrant crisis uh, has demonstrated to everybody, every one of us here. So that's on one thing. So what we do on the elements, items on the concurrent list, and how do we proceed? That's number one. And number two, as you rightly touched on, the public policy making, particularly during a crisis like this. So I've got a little bit of a context to it, in the sense that public policy in a developed world is more of a static public policy, as
Mhm.
in, like, you have a lot of the social demographics, physical demographics now changing in a particular way, and you know for sure as to what is going to be the rise in population, what is going to be the rise in concomitant rise in everything else, including vehicles, labor, production activity, manufacturing, so on and so forth. But then in India, we deal with a dynamic, public policy situation. You know, you build a bridge, or you build a flyover, and then you estimate population and everything else which is forward linked
Right.
to it to grow by certain proportion, but then it grows by altogether another proportion for various reasons of not being able to simulate things, or various other reasons. So my question is, in that context, how do we approach, particularly COVID-19 kind of situation provides a lot more dynamics to the public policy making. It's not just here; it's everywhere in the world, and all over the world, the responses have been either knee jerk. I mean, there's so many different responses, like the
Absolutely.
one that you see in Sweden, the one that you see in Brazil, the one that you see in the US, the one that you saw in China, and the
Absolutely.
statecraft acting so very differently in different ways as it has panned out. Uh, so let me put now the
Absolutely.
questions after setting the context. One,
Yeah.
how do we move towards a solution when we're dealing with concurrent subjects, and going forward, what could be that safety valve that we could build within public policy to handle such dynamic issues? And two, how is it that one needs to respond to a dynamic public policy stimulus, such as COVID-19, or any such disasters, catastrophes we, we would come across? So there are these two questions to you.
Sure. So I'll take the second one first, right? Essentially, uh, responding to the dynamism, and particularly in cities of India or mega cities, and then specifically Delhi, responding to the dynamism that is inherent there is, in my opinion, and based on what I'm looking at right now, a task also of appropriately identifying uh, the elements of that dynamism. And what I mean by that in this context of, because public, when we're talking about policy, we're talking about governance. So the dynamism inherent to the governance of the cities in India, and specifically Delhi, is that these are cities that are governed by many stakeholders, multiple stakeholders across, in particular sub particular spheres. Um, Now, one of the things that's coming out of this, there are two things. One is, what we're seeing is we are seeing the potential for the incredible capacities that some of these stakeholders have. We see in Delhi, the government does have capacity, because as soon as the lockdown happened and it became apparent that several, people were uh, and the poor were not able to secure food, were not able to secure a place to stay because all these things had been taken away from them so abruptly. The state was able to respond by notifying several institutions of for service delivery, hunger resource centers. So immediately, within about a week, there were about 650 sites, 660 sites Okay, they converted school kitchens, the kitchens in schools into these sites. They notified about another 100 or so as temporary relief centers. Now, the implementation of these sites is what then that's where the bottleneck is. So on one hand, you have the capacity to have sites of provision. That says a lot about a government. That says a lot about uh, a policy ecosystem in a time of crisis. But and what I'm looking at now is, despite that, we have pockets in the 11 districts of Delhi of severe uh, distress. Wazipur, Okla, uh, places that had, I mean, places that were known locally to have informal factories, home-based work. Um, but of course, they were off the grid. And once this crisis happened, what you were seeing is several types of these factories, several types of these work regimes. Now the kind of the roof is taken off of that, and you see, or what's going on in there. And what's going on is that several of these people are left without, right? So even though there were sites that were notified in some of these areas, people can't get to those sites because mobility is restricted. Um, because the way that the cities are planned out, sorry, that are not planned, they're not planned. The way that the city's laid out is that despite the fact that some of these sites are physically not far from where these distressed communities are, they can't get there because of certain barriers, right? So these are all bottlenecks of that are created by kind of overlapping dynamisms. You have one dynamism of the state being able to say, hey, people are in crisis. Well, we can just notify all of these areas and as fast as possible to get them help. And that says a lot about the capacity of the state. But then, despite that, we're still not able to secure the rations. We're still not able to process the e-rations, right? Um, Meaning if people don't have a ration card and they're technically legally allowed to apply online, and yet they still can't get them. So the my response to this is that there are these complexities, these dynamisms across various spaces. Um, Literally space, meaning the geographies of cities, but then also how certain responsibilities in policy implementation are owned by specific stakeholders in government and outside of government. And untangling this is almost always a task of localized analysis uh, because things are so diffuse, especially in Delhi. You have multiple jurisdictions, you have multiple verticals and horizontals, multiple state and non-state actors having to forcibly at times work together to get something done, and it's often the outcome is too many cooks spoil the broth, and this is what we have in Delhi. And it's not just Delhi, but Delhi is a case, but the large cities of India.
Well, that's right. Just continuing on this response, even before getting to the solutions per se, I wanted to ask this question as the last but one question, but then bringing it in here because of the amount of dynamism that's involved in policy making. We critique a lot of developing world's policy making all along, all of us, me including. We critique policy making in the developing world, but the dynamism that they face is huge.
Yes, absolutely.
I want to paraphrase that with the dynamism in policy making that's required by COVID-19, and you see a lot of these developed countries policy making which has very well-oiled statecraft, state machinery. They've
Right.
not been able to respond. They've not been able to respond probably the way a lot of these developing countries have been able to respond to the dynamism that is
Yeah.
involved in policy making, which has been tested all through the world. And the take so far is that the developed world has responded not so very well compared to the developing world. So the question to you is like, what are the challenges of policy making when you have a disaster like this, and when you have a dynamism induced by a disaster like this?
Well, one of the major challenges is we've been discussing here is appropriately identifying and understanding the heterogeneity of the most vulnerable populations. And in our case here, what's uh, coming to light is that we have masses of people, depending on the figures of migrants, 400 million or above. We have a critical mass of uh, people in the country that are incredibly vulnerable. And we have to acknowledge that. We have to we may have to start focusing on other indicators outside of GDP or outside of just economic growth indicators to focus on some indicators of vulnerability or of risks that pertain to one, demographics, populations, two, systems. What are the areas of our policy uh, response systems, both disaster management and poverty alleviation policies that are supposed to address people living in distress already chronically. What are the in those systems? What are the critical vulnerabilities, right? Because, and the reason I mention that point is because in the informal sector, uh, there are different regimes, the legal regimes for different demographics or sections of the informal labor force, right? So the construction workers, there are there's labor. It's not robust, but there's a labor regime for construction workers. There's a labor regime for street vendors, right? There's a legislation, um, and what we see is while those legislations or those regimes are supposed to protect those specific types of workers, that they're similarly vulnerable at a time such as this, which means that there's a higher order vulnerability, and that's and this is just a hypothesis, but it needs to be kind of tested. It needs to be kind of examined, which is that higher order vulnerability is the way that number one, the way that those policies are designed, um, and number two, the understanding of the people for which they're designed for. Maybe on both fronts we're lacking severely. And so dynamism here, to me, must correspond with an accurate understanding of vulnerability, because that's what I think the story of COVID in India. And this is not to downplay the disease itself or the true risk of the increasing number of cases that are not being identified, because that's a reality. I'm just saying that there is a um, simultaneous, a concomitant vulnerability that's happening, which is masses of people that are evidently not being able to um, access the state at this critical time. And I think that we need to disaggregate all, throughout where that's happening, how it's happening, and why it's happening. And it's a huge task, but that's the task before us, I think, at this moment.
So you partially answered that last question as well, but then just to elicit a few more views on how do we build those long-term solutions to crises like this? relatively long-term crises like this. Because you have a hurricane, you have a typhoon, you have a disaster management as an extended tool of public policy taking care of those situations. But then you have relatively longer crises like this. Do we need to mull over responses in public policy for situations like this?
Oh, absolutely. I think we have had, okay, outside of this particular acute crisis, we have had several crises in the last decades or so that have been treated as uh, or I should say that for which public policies have come about as a kind of first responder in a first responder way or in an emergency context. What I mean by that is, if you look at some of the policies like the Food Security Act, right, started as a public interest litigation to address starvation deaths. Now, starvation that's a crisis, right? That's a public that's a food security crisis. It's a public health crisis. Um, and the use of public interest litigations in that context was to put out the fire, right? To get the state to do something. It was to respond to an emergency. So you have a regime or you have a law that eventually gets passed about 12 years later that is supposed to be the legal response to that emergency. But what happens is too often is that it's left at the level of uh, I don't want to say band-aid, but it doesn't go far enough in reversing the emergency. And too many times this has happened with shelters. Homeless shelters came out of a public interest litigation, which was the same public interest litigation of the starvation deaths. Just 9 years later, it was added to that public interest litigation, which was to stop the deaths of people on the streets. So again, it's a response to an emergency, but and then now we're still left in kind of like a at a state of it's neither here, it's neither there. I mean, the shelters are places where people can go, but they do not really address the acute types of poverty that these people are facing. So I think so what do we learn in a type of situation where everyone says knows that this is a crisis, where it's publicly, widely, globally acknowledged that we're in a crisis? Well, I think that we learn from the lessons of the recent past to say that when we do have a crisis, whether it is locally acknowledged or globally acknowledged, we we put mechanisms in place to our policies that actually actually reciprocate, that actually provide rights and that actually go further than just trying to provide the least amount of support that's necessary to stop somebody from dying. That uh, we need we need protections, social protections that are there in the interest of well-being, and not merely in the interest of merely preventing destitution. And again, that's a normative shift in the way we think. We must think in at a plane that sees well-being as a target versus avoiding catastrophe. And
Right.
I think that that's what that this time period is teaching us, that lesson, that that's where we must go. I mean, our minds must be headed in that direction.
Right, right. So that's pretty much all from me, Ashwin. Just to put that whole thing back together, and maybe I would want you to comment the last comment on these things, as in, now that we have the dynamism built within, I mean, the stimulus of these crises,
Yeah.
and that enmeshed with the kind of migrant crisis that we've had. the labor crisis that we've had as a consequence of this whole issue being a concurrent subject in the constitution and lack of response by the bureaucrats who have been day in and day out working with data pertaining to migrants, including the quinquennial surveys that we've been conducting in NSS4 on the migrants issue. I agree with you that we need to build in capacities. We need to build in a swift response mechanisms, and that probably is one way of addressing this issue going forward. In so to say reforming public policies. Yeah. Any last comments from you?
Yeah, just to add on to just what you've just said here, specific to migrants, we need to really grapple with labor mobility in some way, and part of we've been using this word dynamism because it's apt. Uh, Part of what makes specific sites difficult to govern, with city, state, is their natural interconnectedness through the flow of labor, and we need to start really understanding how policymaking will need to address that issue, which we're seeing that there's a critical mass of people that are building the country, that are building the cities, that are essentially the frontline workers of India's development, if we can call it that, for which we have no real understanding of how to put in place policies for. And I think that that's something that we need to really consider going forward.
You're right. You're right. No two questions on that. So thank you very much, Ashwin. It's been a real nice conversation with you.
It's been a pleasure.
On COVID-19, in the series on COVID-19, past, present, and future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Reddy. Thank you.